Welcome in from your SUV, from your tractor or your ute, or maybe you're even riding your electric motorbike. But from wherever you are, you're with Alistair Moorhead and Glenn Judson, and this is the Al and Juddy Show. Well, what we want to do is reach out and provide you some technical information on a range of agricultural topics which may interest you, but to do it in a different way. Casual and comfortable format that allows you to listen where you want and when you want. This is intended for general information, and for more specific advice, contact your local Agricom rep. Oh, g'day Alistair. You looking well? Have you had a new fringe cut there? Or is that your eyebrows? I'm not sure. Anyway, what are we going to be talking about today?
Oh, it's a great pleasure for us to host today a practicing veterinarian from Fielding, Trevor Cook, and we're going to be discussing the recent history of internal parasite control in New Zealand. And context to this is that I first met Trevor in the late 90s on another person we hosted on the show, Chris Chamberlain. For some of you may have listened to a podcast in the past about him. And he's got a finishing block that is quite an intensive unit. And I crossed paths with Trevor in the late 90s as the discussion of parasite control for hoggets and lamb trading on an intensive finishing block was really heating up for that business. So
excellent.
Welcome, Trevor.
Welcome, Trevor.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe we should just start in terms of getting to know our guest, Alistair, and probably, Trevor, a little bit about your background, where you're from and what do you get up to?
Okay. Right. Great to be here. Well, I grew up in Taranaki. Went to university way back to do an ag science degree to go back to Taranaki and particularly involved with the dairy industry. Got captured by the glamour of a veterinary degree. And so in those days, it was very easy to change from the ag sci degree to the veterinary degree.
Wow. Times have changed.
So did a veterinary degree and have spent a lifetime working with production animals as a veterinarian. But my interest in whole farm production, whole farm profitability has always remained. And over the last, I guess, 15 to 20 years, I've just spent more and more time working with farmers around developing productive, sustainable farming systems. And
which is exactly why you're here today, Trevor, because this is exactly our wheelhouse.
Yeah, absolutely. So, just a couple of questions to unpick some of this. What was your first car?
My first car was an Austin A30 when I was at university. The first vehicle I had at university was a motorbike.
Right.
That's what I had in the first year. And the second year, I scrabbled enough funds together, which for I was working in the university holidays, picking up hay and relief milking and that sort of thing, and bought an A30, which I had with me for the whole time I was at university and sold when I graduated and moved into something better.
At least you had something to sell at the end of that, unlike one certain John McKenzie.
Yeah. He never had the privilege of selling his first car. And quite reliable those Austins, aren't they?
Oh yes.
And you could fix them with whatever you had in the back of the car.
Completely unlike yours, by the way, which we called the Pram because you had to push start it every time.
Yes, that's right. That was an Austin as well, but one that was in not great repair. Your favourite dish to cook? Are you a bit of a chef or?
I'm an absolute chef. I mean, with a surname like I have, it would be a danger to, and it would be expected. But my favourite dish is eggs because of the versatility in that they can be cooked in several ways. And what people don't realise is that the way they're cooked alters the way the protein is denatured. So a fried egg does take different from a boiled egg because of the way different way it's cooked, different heats, which change the way the nature is altered in that process.
I love the scientist coming through in the chef.
I think the cook would understand that most. Though.
Absolutely. Yeah. And interesting we're talking about protein because I think that's going to be a theme as we come to production in production animals. Final question. What sort of music do you like listening to?
A whole variety of, a big variety of music, but certainly some older music like Jethro Tull type music is always in my favourite list.
Excellent. I think we covered ours, Alistair, but we won't go there.
Yeah.
I guess to frame up this discussion, we're talking about production animals, we're talking about production systems, and talking about how internal parasites interact with that and some of the issues and some of the ways we can overcome those. I guess to start off with, what I thought we might do is just get Trevor to describe kind of the state of the nations. In New Zealand, where are we currently in terms of our ability to control internal parasites?
Unfortunately, 90% of internal parasite management over the last 50 years has been through the use of anthelmintics. And we've had the luxury of having very effective anthelmintics for a long, long time. And because they've been so effective, we've lost sight of the fact that there's a cost to having internal parasites in our system, just because particularly lambs have to consume these larvae, and in doing so they have a lower appetite, so therefore they don't grow so fast. And that's the impact of that has been masked because we've been able to use effective anthelmintics. Visually we don't see a problem, but in actual fact there's a production problem. So any system that has to drench lambs or calves every 28 days, which is common from one end of the country to the other, there is a live weight gain cost. There's a massive live weight gain cost if that's the level of challenge, which we've suppressed the evidence of by using an effective anthelmintic. But we've got to the end of the road because throughout the country, those anthelmintics are failing and failing fast.
And it was interesting. We talked a little bit about, the first one that came out, and what was remarkable to me was it wasn't actually that long ago, in terms of, the history of sheep farming in New Zealand, for example, that we haven't actually had those drugs for that long.
Well, 1964 was when farmers throughout the world got their first access to a fully effective broad-spectrum anthelmintic. And that, to me, is one of the game changers in our ruminant management, because for the first time, we could massively reduce the impact of internal parasites on production.
Reducing deaths, increasing fecundity, lifting productivity.
Yes, well, in the first instance, the big effect was it reduced the deaths because we did not have anthelmintics good enough to stop that autumn rise, and lambs in the autumn were dying in big numbers, and thiabenzole stopped that. It enabled faster growth rates, so old-time farmers told me that 45 kilo tudus were the normal, and thiabenzole put that up to 55 kilo tudus. So thiabenzole was an absolute game changer in the same way that flying on fertiliser and sheep scanning that we always talk about, but thiabenzole was one of the biggies.
And I guess because it was so effective and everybody was using it, probably brings us to, the start of some resistance building up. When was kind of in your career the first time that you started seeing some of these issues?
Well, in the very late 70s, we were starting to see some failure, but it was a novelty then. It was absolute novelty. And it was like, you talk about it, wow, we got a bit of leakage after a 10-day drench check sort of thing. But when that started happening, the drench companies were very innovative and created combinations, which straight away we went back to fully effective products. And as those first ones started to fail, they just added more to them. And so we've had a long period of still having effective anthelmintics because we made combinations. But even they have started to fail. In fact, they are it's unusual now to find a farm that does not have triple drench resistance.
Wow. So we've probably got to the point where all of the known actives we've probably used up, if you like, and we've got to a point now where we're probably standing on the side of the cliff going, we actually don't have anything more. Once we've got our last active, and once we've got some leakage out of that, that's it.
Well, we got the new actives came on the market, over 10 years ago now, which gave everybody hope that we've still had those products that we could use, but they are failing frequently too.
Yeah.
So,
and I assume they are because the need was great to use them.
Yes.
And it's through the reliance on the use that the pathway does.
Well, I think that the establishment of resistance to those new actives arrived far quicker than what was predicted.
Do you think that was because we were developing these resistant populations that were resilient, not just resistant, but becoming more resilient?
No, I think it's more likely that by the time we started using them, we already had deep-seated triple drench resistance, and to some extent there must have been some cross resistance.
Yeah.
So this is not a new thing, and I guess it in some respects we've kind of
we've been masking it for 30, 40 years. We've been masking the presence of it through options. So tell me, when did you pivot a little bit from being the medicinal correction, the anthelmintic correction by drenching? When did you pivot to that production philosophy, which I assume was there? I assume it emerged quite early in your career.
Well, yes, from way back, we knew that we got high growth rates of lambs going onto new pasture, and it was assumed that most of that was because of the high quality. Yeah. When in actual fact, most of that high growth rate was because of the very, very low worm challenge. Yeah. Which and it's frustrated me that the focus has been on drench, when in actual fact, if we'd spent all this last 30 years focusing more on the production gains by changing our systems, we'd be in a much better space, because as a consequence, our worm management is less dependent on having an effective anthelmintic. Whereas now we're being forced into those system changes in the presence of products that aren't 100% effective.
I've heard you speak previously, and I think one of the points that really struck me was when we started talking about the fact that only about 5% of the total worm population is actually inside the animal, and the 95% is actually
in the landscape.
And how we ever thought we were going to control or have at least some control over those populations by focusing on the 5% and not on the 95%. And I guess the conversation that we're having in terms of these forage and farm systems is actually looking at the 95% and saying, how can we manage those? And that will also benefit the impact of that 5%.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And that's actually what's nice, because it's a more holistic approach to the whole process as opposed to a singular solution type approach.
So I think we're going to come back, because I think it's going to be really interesting looking at some examples that you've had and the things that you've changed and the impact that that's had. But I thought just so that we're all on the same page here, maybe we should just have a quick refresher, if you like, of the life cycle of some of these internal parasites and some of the terminology that and the strategies that we use to try and control them. So Trevor, give me a real thumbnail sketch of the life cycle of an internal parasite.
Okay. The part of the life cycle that everybody knows about is the adults that are inside the gut. They're either in the small intestine or in the abomasum. And in the worm population, there's males and females, so they have a standard mating program, and so a consequence of that is that they lay eggs, and those eggs come out in the feces.
I'll explain that to you later, Alistair.
Thanks, Juddy, thanks. But also, just just to fully understand, that does mean they have a highly variable gene pool, because they are combining themselves and so they're not asexual like some of the insects we've been discussing.
They're not clones.
They're not clones. Yeah.
So those eggs come out in the feces. In the right conditions, those eggs will hatch, and out of that comes an L1 larvae. It's a 5-stage larval process, with the adults being the L5s. So the L1s come out. Under the right conditions, they will molt to an L2, and under the right conditions, they'll molt to an L3. So that whole free living stage occurs outside the animal, is highly exposed to the environment that they're in.
Sunlight,
but
heat,
is evolved out of pastoral grazing system. So it loves grasses and it loves dense pastures. And that's where it goes. That's where it lives best. We've got an L3 larvae as the product of that free living stage. And that L3 larvae is a different beast, because it can survive for long periods of time. And if it's cool and it's protected from the dry and the ultraviolet light, it can last for months and months and months. So for most farms throughout the country, right now on the pastures, the L3 larvae are what were put there last autumn. And that's the sort of length they can survive.
And so just to be really clear, those L3 larvae are still able to infect an animal that eats them?
Oh, yes.
And
yes.
they have been there for that period of time?
Yes. I mean, back when we used to do larval culturing in our lab, we kept Couperia for a year and take them out and warm them up, and they were still wriggling.
Yeah.
So
just, this is not my world at all, but tell me a bit about that L3. Is it the primary larval stage that the animal gets access to?
That's the only stage.
So it's the mobile stage.
That's the infective stage that lives in a water bubble. Is when it's consumed can establish infection, etc., etc.
But it actually moves. It's physically capable of moving.
Yes.
And so it can be a stationary. It can be a dormant. What you've just described, the length of time it can survive. It can be a dormant for whole periods of time. But when the conditions are ideal, moisture content's ideal, it physically can sort of like swim upriver like a trout.
In a way, yes, because its only function in life is to get consumed. So therefore it's going to put itself in a better position to get consumed.
So it's quite an active.
But it doesn't matter.
Or does it colonise at the very start of the growth of a plant, or does it actually move up the plant with those?
Well, the bulk of them are in a zone maybe 5 centimetres above the ground. I think that's overstated as to where they are.
Okay.
Given that their ability to move. But no matter at any time that an L3 larvae is consumed by a susceptible animal, it will infect.
Okay.
So even if it's cold and not very active. So when it's cold, the free living stage shuts down, but the L3 larvae survives that. So from a contamination point of view, contamination doesn't happen when it's dry and when it's cold because the free living stage doesn't happen. But the L3 larvae, once they're formed, can survive, and we know that they can go well down into the soil to retain moisture.
Yeah, okay. So that's my point though, is that they can exist in different locations and they are actually quite an active type that when they can move through that profile.
I think the other thing that demonstrates, and I think it's a really important point here, is once you've got contamination, right, it's really difficult by the sounds of things to decontaminate without a fair bit of work and a fair bit of time, it sounds like. So I think as we move on, I think what's going to become really important here is the idea that if we can try and stop contamination, that's probably our best strategy. Reduce. Yeah.
So when we complete that story, though, that L3 larvae is consumed. So Prof. Cook did some work way back showing the production consequence of lambs eating L3 larvae, and it's largely through reducing appetite. Those L3 larvae molt to L4s, which molt to L5s, which are the adult, and the cycle is completed. The significance of that cycle is that every component of that cycle we have some control over. Every single part of it, we can do something that alters the outcome. Yeah. Yet what we've done is just focused on giving a chemical to remove the adults.
Which is a really powerful message, isn't it? At every stage, you've got an opportunity.
Yes.
And yet we're at the moment, we are largely exercising one.
Well, so that's a really nice point to pivot on, but I think there's a few more things to tick off in this discussion, but we should come back and actually go through those stages and try to link something to each stage.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that would be a good way to approach that.
So the other thing we often talk about in some of this, and we're trying to get some of the terminology, obviously in there's some different forages, and we'll talk about that in those different stages. Refuge is a term that's often thrown around. I thought it was
what does that mean?
Well, I thought it was a Caribbean holiday destination to start with. But Trevor, you might like to give us a really simple explanation of what refugia is.
Refugia is just a concept that allows unselected parasites to reproduce, as opposed to parasites that can only survive if they survive the chemical, the drench. And we've known for a long time, if we used effective anthelmintics in conjunction with refugia, those anthelmintics would stay effective for a long time.
So that as a layman who I think might practice this is where you drench selectively, recognizing that you want to keep the greatest genetic diversity in your landscape,
in your worms,
in your worm landscape, and that although the ones you drench might be leaning towards more resistant types, if the majority are not drenched, you've got the genetic diversity to cross-pollinate inside the animal and slow the process of full.
You're trying
resistance.
to dilute down the bad ones.
Yeah, by maintaining broad genetic diversity.
That's it.
Is that
And I think that even though we've known that for a long, long time, that message, I think we've been very poor in promoting the importance of that message.
I think that would be something that I, as a young agronomist, listening to you and Chris, brainstorm practices on his lease block, which was quite intensive. I think that was one of the very earliest take-home messages I got from those listening in on your discussions, was just that topic.
It's really interesting. But when you think about it, I know when I was in the raceway drenching lambs in my past, sometimes you got the little bit of dye that went on the end of the drench gun, and the adage was always, make sure you don't miss one. Yeah. And so really, really interesting that actually some of that advice is probably counterproductive.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And also the on one hand, we're promoting the value of low challenge and the growth, the production value of low challenge. But on the other hand, we're suggesting there's some value in having some challenge. So it's been a very hard concept to actually
because I think that's the absolute nub of this, right? And I'm glad you pulled me up before. What we're saying here is the optimum here is low challenge, not no challenge. Because I don't think we're ever going to run internal parasites out of town. But what we need to be able to do is control the infection rate, if you like, by the amount of challenge.
Which will come back to our little discussion around the different stages.
Well, when you look at the successful organic sheep farmers that don't use anthelmintics, it is all about maintaining low challenge.
Yeah. All the strategies. And to be fair, that would be a really good point, because some of the techniques that we've got, it's probably a really good point to start to actually go through those. Yeah, sure. So just out of interest, which stage of life do you start with when you try to look at, not breaking, but let's just say moderating?
I reckon what we do, I think what we should do is start at the adult, right?
Okay.
And we know actually there are a number of different drenches, anthelmintics that we can use that can either control some or all of the populations. And I guess the point actually, and I know you were making that on the Argentine stem level podcast, where you were going, when you look at a country like this, there's probably pockets where the worm populations, or in some farms where the worm populations are still responding, actually are still being controlled by some groups of anthelmintic. So it's not a homogenous. But
no, I think it is.
So we've got to that point, is really where you're coming from. We've now got to the point with trading
what I'm finding is I'm seeing farms from Gore to Kerry with the same level of triple drench resistance.
Right. So we've actually got past the pockets to
pockets. We have now got.
But I think
and trading will have done that.
I think that's what's happened since 1964. Every year on every farm, we've just selected for a more double copy resistant worms. And it's almost like an evolutionary change that's occurred in the whole worm population. That's meant that very much at the same time everywhere on farms we've just got more worms carrying the resistant genes than worms that aren't carrying the resistant genes.
Yeah, if you look at a population curve, what we've really done is shifted the whole curve in one direction. We've allowed that bottom 5% to actually become the new mean of the genetic diversity.
Yeah. So at that adult, what are the things that what things we can control?
Okay, at that adult, we absolutely know that sheep and lambs all ewes that are fed well are way less impacted by worms, by the parasites that they've got. So nutrition is a major part of it, and just well-fed animals are more resilient.
So we'll circle back to that, because that's a real strategic discussion. can I just quickly ask that question, that challenging question, is that in that well-fed animal with an immune system that's being fully engaged and enough energy and protein to carry on doing okay, does animal behaving in that sort of okay performance range because of the nutritional profile shed less eggs?
Probably, yes. So when we look at our ewes, we know that all mammals, when they get close to parturition, have a drop in some of their immune systems, and we get an increase in resilience in a way to internal parasites. In sheep, we can easily measure that through fecal egg counts. So over lambing, we have this periparturient rise, which is a rise in fecal egg counts, can start as early as 6 weeks before lambing. It's usually gone by the time we get to tailing, and where that resistance steps back in. So we know that the nutritional status of the ewe influences that how high that periparturient rise is.
And there was some really good work out of Lincoln quite early that demonstrated that, with nutrition, but in particularly protein was really important in terms of that resilience. And we've actually published some work on some of the forages that lend themselves to that high intakes and high protein.
It's super interesting because you're thinking about the linkage to your pastoral landscape, and we are discussing a massive decline in pasture quality at weaning.
Yes.
We've lambed, and your lambing time frame will be based on your spring production curve and what you can generate through winter to what your lambing date is. And in virtually all circumstances, we attempt to capture as much as the high quality phase of spring as we can while the ewe is in full lactation. But the moment we wean, we're moving on to a landscape that's getting hotter, lignifying pasture. And you tend to find if the clover content is only moderate in these sort of landscapes, we're going in a declining protein landscape as well. So lignin, fiber, low protein, all these things are happening on the weaning phase.
Yeah, but I think the periparturient rise is overplayed in that, especially in the South Island, when those ewes are in the phase of having a higher egg output by being in that state, it's still pretty cold. The free living stage really isn't that active. The bulk of pasture contamination is what was put there last autumn.
Yeah, so they're still eating what was there from last autumn during the...
Yeah. So we've got nutrition is really important. What are the other things?
So that's for the adult.
That's for the adult. For the adult worm, is there anything else
similarly is genetics, and we've got some breeding programs throughout the country that have developed sheep that can cope with having worms, either through being able to tolerate them, and certainly that has been very successful, but also resist them. And so there are some breeders where you can buy rams where the offspring from those rams are much more able to cope with living in a worm in a worm challenge environment. What I'm finding is in most of our worms, most of our systems, that worm and so the effect has to be with lambs, because the whole problem is with lambs. Lambs are the big contaminators. They are the most susceptible, and so I think it's unrealistic to think genetics are actually going to make a big enough difference where those lambs are under a high challenge from L3 larvae. But soon as you change the system where that challenge is much, much lower, genetics start to really make a difference. So genetics, right at that stage, we have the we have the ability to influence the outcome, because we can have a breeding program of the host that deals with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose I'd like to see, right, so there's two things that have occurred here, but the damaging part to the animal's immune system is the adult in the two locations it can be, depending on species and loading, I suppose. But is there anything that once we know that's in the system that we can manage the recontamination? Because I assume that we move straight from adult to L1s.
Yeah, so let's just unpack that. So we've got nutrition and we've got the breeding. Is there anything else in the toolbox that we can use in terms of controlling the adult worm?
No, I mean they're biggie.
I guess the other one we're going is anthelmintic, and I guess the ability to actually understand whether it's working or not for me is the big one. Is going, it might not actually even be a tool unless you're able,
if you've got full resistance,
unless you can demonstrate that it's actually working. So,
but most of the flocks that I deal with, and I guess I'm lucky in that I'm dealing with generally better performing systems, and
I've been dealing with this for so long now. They've got processes in place,
and they do not drench ewes.
Yeah,
interesting.
And if we feed sheep to get the maximum production out of them, they are very able to tolerate worms and don't need to be drenched.
Yeah, great point. So let's move on to so now we've got these
adults going through the ewe, because we've identified that well-fed ewe, she's going to be shedding eggs.
Yep. So they're producing eggs in a process I'll talk to you about later, Alistair. So once that fecal material has been dropped on the pasture and it's got eggs in it, what are things we can do at that point that might help us in the whole system?
There's probably not a lot we can do. Just remembering that our parasitic worms are pasture based. So if they've dropped into a platform of
a sward or a thatch,
so the nature of that pasture, so those eggs have to be exposed to some oxygen, and then they'll hatch, and out comes the L3 larvae. If it's too cool, that doesn't happen. If it's too dry, that doesn't happen. We can't influence either of those things. And so we just got to accept, okay, that's going to happen. Our opportunity is how we manage the end result of that process with the L3 larvae, because there's not a lot we can do to change what's going to happen in that free living stage.
So between egg, L1 and L2, it's a lot of environmental interactions, and they just hunker down until they're happy to move on.
And I guess the really interesting thing here is that you might not see the result of that until you get those the environment where it encourages that.
Oh, well, let's think about this also. There is a couple, really, because if we cultivate that paddock, and you can, so you load up a paddock through the big grazing phases of the spring grazings particularly, you then can cultivate that paddock and zero it, can't you? The other one would be, what would be the impact of intense summer grazing where you're exposing it to a lot of light through the summer conditions?
Yeah, well, I don't like ultraviolet light.
Like so if you've got it's got a double edge, haven't you? In a summer dry environment where you might end up with highly exposed land. It's both negative and positive, because the flow-on effect of it being there still is negative in an autumn recovery, but you reduce a little bit.
Yes, but that's all about when we've got to the L3, the actual free living stage of eggs hatching and molting. There's not a lot we can do.
It's still not. Yeah.
But we know it's happening there. Yeah. And we know that L3 larvae are there because that process has happened. Yeah. So then our opportunity is how we to stop that being multiplied up with a susceptible and contaminating.
Oh, sorry,
land.
my brain keeps on just diving off into other little consequential moments. So I mentioned that there is one thing we can do, which is cultivate a paddock. Yeah. What happens if we direct drill a paddock?
Yeah, well, I'm quite happy with what I see, that desiccating actually takes it away because it
takes the pathways away.
No, lets the ultraviolet light in.
Yeah, so you're opening it up through the death of the plants, and predominantly speaking, if the direct drilling is going to a crop, there's a much less hostile environment for the movement of this larval phase. But if it's going to a grass, there are still chances that the feces and dung in the paddock will still host.
But the desiccation is allowing a lot more light to get in.
Yeah, so there'll still be
larvae don't like.
So there will be a reducing of the challenge, but not a removal of the challenge like cultivation. Yeah. Okay, it's worth understanding that.
It is, because I think then we start thinking about some of the practices you do on farm that you can kind of tick the box and say, that's certainly going to help in terms of a challenge.
The way I interpret it in a way is if I did a grass-to-grass cultivation, I have probably got a genuinely young pasture safe. Yep. If I direct drill grass-to-grass, the reality is I have reduced challenge because I have exposed to UV, but you cannot stop it all, and you should not expect a directorial grass to grass to be as cleaner an environment as a cultivated landscape. Is that a fair call? Yeah, no, that's good to understand because that's a nice wee process.
Cool. And so what are the other things we can do in terms of that L3 infective larvae state that might help us in terms of control?
Okay, well, largely cattle and sheep don't share the same parasites. It's not complete, but it's different enough that cattle are a very valuable tool. And it's interesting,
The vacuum cleaner. It's like a vacuum cleaner discussion, isn't it, really?
Yeah, I think that's overstated hugely.
Okay, yep.
I mean, the value is a cattle, it's not a sheep. Twice a year I help farmers over the other side of the world that have moved into pasture grazing systems. So a lot of them come over here and they think it's quite fascinating that we're out on our hills, we've got sheep and cattle running together. Yeah. And for good reason, we've got cattle in those systems. But one of the tools that we have to start, I think cattle grazing with sheep have minimal effect on the level of challenge. But if we can set up our grazing areas that are just cattle, and as part of breaking that cycle, it becomes a very powerful tool for creating pastures that got a much, much lower level of pasture contamination.
So to understand that means you're literally talking about the pasture will change its job on the farm. So you'll go through a phase of cattle grazing. You might go through 2 rotations or 3 rotations of grazing with cattle.
Yes.
And each time the future challenge of that grassland will actually decline.
But even if those grazing areas are cattle only for a substantial period of time, they will lower the level. And it's not, and the cattle probably are eating some sheep L3 larvae, but most of the time it's because they're not sheep.
Yeah, okay. In other words, not continuing to shed back into that landscape.
Yeah, and then the time factor then goes.
That's the thing I've missed in that whole conversation. Is it? Yeah, I get it. So they're not sheep, so they're not recolonizing, and actually, the longer you leave, you still do go through life cycles where they finally run out of juice. I assume they just don't last forever, and the longer you can keep under cattle grazing, not reshedding L3 larvae back onto that land. It's not just the fact they're consuming some. Yeah, it's the fact that they're not building more.
I like that.
Does that sound right?
Yeah, because I think one of the great take-home message is actually cattle aren't sheep. And I think if you understand that from a internal parasite concept, right, I think it's very powerful.
And it's just, that blows my mind. Even that is a real light bulb moment for me. And the cattle aren't sheep, really obvious statement. But the obvious part is that because they're not sheep, they are not recontaminating and not continuing to build the contamination risk.
Okay, so what other things have we got in our toolbox in terms of the...
there's a moment for me.
So there's a variety of... so in any one farm where I'm looking at how we might... the ultimate aim is no lambs are weaned onto contaminated pastures, so not going back onto lambing paddocks. Not that we've already thought ahead and we've got 100 hectares that we didn't have lambs on the previous autumn. So therefore that's cleaner. We're going to put in some summer crop, which takes care of so many lambs. And we've got those cattle blocks, the Frisian bulls of 2-year-old bulls are gone by November and lambs. So I look at how much area we can create that's going to have a low level of challenge. And to me, that almost sets the size of the ewe flock unless we're prepared to sell store lambs.
So it's almost like creating a new farm feed budget with a whole different vision of what you're doing. So you're identifying how many hectares you've got that has got a really low risk based on it being, for example, grass to grass in an uncultivated, uncontaminated sort of minimal contamination, how much crop we're dedicating to and how many kgs of dry matter that might grow based on the amount of area. So you've suddenly got a feed budget where you can actually work out just how many animals you can hold on low risk.
And this is really important where we've got a farm where I'm dealing with several farms where we've got no drenches which are fully effective.
Yeah. So you've got no magical tool.
We have to do something different. And it's unlikely that you're going to be able to create low challenge for the whole crop just by doing this.
True.
It's going to be a combination of things.
Yeah, I really would like to take that moment, recognising, we're getting to, our wheelhouse of which we have done throughout our whole career, which is creating highly nutritious feed profiles. And this is actually a big deal at the moment because it all comes at a cost. And so putting in crops comes at a cost. And I feel often when you are spending, you're always looking for a direct income to justify your spending. And I feel, and I am the first person to say that, and you and I have discussed this over time, we put crops in that are biologically functional. We are very confident that on average, if the weather in summertime isn't overcast, and there is sun shining in summertime and it's nice warm environments, all of our crops function.
Talking brassica crop.
All of them.
Yep.
Chicories, red clovers, brassica. Now, whether they're economic will nearly always be associated with the trading of and the value proposition of how you buy stock and the value proposition you put on the value you create over the time of grazing, clip the ticket and sell your end product. And quite regularly, when you do the maths on a traded lamb or the finishing phase of a lamb, the cost of putting crop in and what you gain on the margin of taking it from store to finishing can actually be minimal, like seriously low. But this is where this discussion takes on a whole new dimension, isn't it? Because that's only the obvious and direct sellable revenue component based on the cost. It doesn't, well, pretty much it leads into this conversation of valuing crops and valuing forages for how they fit in the whole system, not just the moment of the taking from a store animal to a finishing animal.
Yeah. Because the other part of that is that summer crop is followed by a new pasture, which also meets the objectives of low challenge. And
so it gets back, though, the value proposition of that crop is not just the fact that you've got a finishing option that may give you a low marginal return. Yes. It's what happens if you don't have the crop.
Oh, yes.
And where does it go? Where does the animal go? Yeah. What is your business options? And that animal is a huge risk to your future business, unless I'm mistaken, if lambs shed the most.
Oh, they're the contaminators. Yeah. So one of the, as we've talked about before, that summer crop is meaning we're actually putting less contamination back onto our hill pastures or wherever.
Or productive flats or...
Yes. And I think one of our challenges is how do we put a value around that?
Yeah, that's a big deal. And that is a big deal because so many people get focused on that margin. Yeah. And the margin is so much easier to calculate when it's just about the sellable product, not the flow-on effect of what happens if your lambs are not on crop. You have to spread them out on 3 to 4 times the area. Mm-hmm. They are the leakiest part of the parasite world, and some of them are your replacement ewe hoggets that you may value getting up to weights. The second part is you go from not finishing fast, so they're an inefficient animal on your landscape, carrying a whole lot of environmental baggage associated with not being efficient. They're then shedding at a high rate when you're wanting your ewe flock to start to be performing in the late summer and early autumn through the mating phase. And their exposure to the contamination from your lambs that are grazed over a much greater area starts to have meaning for your future production cycle. As an agronomist, have I sort of got that?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think without being quite dramatic, right, in some of these situations where we've lost the ability to use anthelmintics, right, the use of crop may be the only thing that you can really do. Not the only thing, but it is the big ticket item to try and reduce the contamination on farm.
Well, yes, but I think for a lot of farms, we've actually have to look at everything.
Yes.
Yeah. And if we've got an 80-20 sheep cattle ratio, I would suggest on a lot of farms we can't carry on having an 80-20 sheep cattle.
Yeah, so the cattle ratio, and to be fair, the trend is in the New Zealand landscape with the decline of the flock.
I work it out on the lambs to everything else ratio. That's the ratio that matters most. Because our ewes are not contaminators, so our ewes are actually are also a tool.
Yeah.
I love that ratio, the lamb to everything else ratio.
Yeah.
I think that's a good one.
Oh, well, I wouldn't mind staying on the crop theme at the moment.
Why?
Yeah, obviously. But I look at it and I think we have some pretty powerful products in our business in the space and have been an integral part of this for a very long time. And it's quite obvious that the summer brassica scenarios, we've touched on this in previous discussions. At times, animals don't like eating them, but they present at a really critical time in a lamb finishing phase, which is post-weaning, in a hot, dry environments often.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes actually the bigger threat areas are actually not the hot, dry areas, but the more moist, summer moist landscapes as well. But the summer crop does provide you an option. And we've got some products like Hunter Leaf Turnip, Main Star Rape, Spitfire Rape. These sort of crops provide the nutritional profiles, but they also provide plant structures that are not really that desirable for L3 larvae to actually move around.
If there's no grass, there's no worms.
Yeah. In a nutshell, there's no grass, there's no L3 larvae.
Which is a really powerful thing because I think coming back to it, it's the grasses and particularly things like the brown tops, which are just the super species for delivering that to the animal. And if we can get away from that, not entirely, but strategically, I think that's a really powerful.
And so that gets me to this next point, is that the New Zealand landscape, we're based here in the Canterbury Plains of New Zealand, which is literally the singular flattest part of New Zealand. What that means is we have the ability to create rectangle paddocks without a lot of topography in them. And that also means that we can cultivate right to the edge of fence lines and things like this. And so the areas of weed grasses and the things that are like probably 2 to 3% of the land area, you get to the greater sheep landscape of the North Island and big chunks of the South Island as well. And probably there's anything between 5 and 25% of these cropping paddocks cannot be cultivated. They're gullies, they're native plants, forest and shrubland, and all of those are full of Danthonia, brown top, high endophyte ryegrass, all sorts of grass species, predominantly low legume content. So the biggest threat we've got with our brassica crops in a situation like that is still the belief that you don't have a cycle going on.
That's right.
And that would be a fair call, that it's sometimes when you look at the performance of animals on crop, we often do above average because the nutritional profile is good, but you can't rule out that there's still not a risk profile in those crops.
And the very high risk is that first month when they're on it, because by choice they don't want to eat Hunter.
Yeah. A good example.
And so in that first month, they'll eat anything but eating Hunter.
Yeah. And by the way, this is my poster child of animals do not, like humans, animals do not know what is good for them. They are not magical and they don't behave as if they're magically in tune with their worlds, because what we've just discussed is these animals that would be happy growing at very low levels, even going backwards, while they're eating this actually quite damaging landscape, which have got toxins from standard endophyte ryegrass, populations of L3 parasite larvae, and they'll be growing at about 50, 60, 80 grams a day. If they ate for that week or two, they're eating that. Meanwhile, that leafy turnip that they do not like eating is highly nutritious, incredibly healthy, and will grow them at 300 grams a day. And their choice is to hurt themselves by eating that other stuff. So very, very human-like.
The kids don't like broccoli.
Yeah, exactly.
Trevor, so in terms of that situation, is there a strategy around how could we better cope with the situation where they might be for the first 3 weeks eating, hoovering up infective larvae before they get onto the crop?
I think we just have to accept that they will establish a worm burden over that time, and so drenching has got to be part of that, and doing some monitoring thereafter to drive what drench inputs there need to be. But to some extent, when you have not got products, you haven't got any products which are fully effective, maybe that's not the effective option.
Yeah, and I guess so coming back to this again, what we're talking about is reducing the challenge, and even if they have a high challenge for a couple of weeks, but then they're onto their crop and they're having they're eating a lot of protein and they're fully fed, then the effects of those worms will not be nearly as large.
Correct. Yeah, and then we've also got the other species that we work with, like the choice chicory systems, where you got the chicory with its upright shape and its high fractional degradation rate, its high protein intakes if it's got good clover content. We got the red clover, which is an interesting one because we obviously lamb on red clover in our systems. Yep. We lamb on red clover and then we put those wean lambs back onto that same crop. But that reflects what you've just said, is that it may not be perfect because it has a higher moisture profile on the outside of the plant because it's got hairs and there's a chance that L3 will move up a little bit.
We don't set L3s on red clover.
You don't. So the reality is it functions at a high rate in that space. So that's quite a positive. But the nutritional profile of the effective protein and the constant ME sees that performance maintained regardless of loading.
Yeah, and so what you might go is there's probably not a UV light there, but the main focus really is the fact that it's not hosting these infective larvae and it's a high nutritional plane. The agrotonic plantain, for example, when we use that in systems, I suspect that there's a lot more light getting into the bottom there because they're quite open. We've got a lot more metabolizable protein coming through, so that's of benefit. And so that system kind of works. As I think Trevor said a couple of times today, anything but grass.
Yeah. I probably the last part of that forage systems one is that, when people ask us or myself about what are the things for the future, what I actually still see coming is we're about to go through another cycle of back to the past, but we're going to go back to the past with different value propositions. We're going to go back to the past where we now have already understood that our first expectations of why we're still not using things today, we now know the expectations and therefore we're not going to be disappointed by, those processes occurring. And the lactation phase for the plantain systems would be a good example. That species is still the most exceptional species to lamb onto. We have, from a per head basis, there is no other forage that's better, no legume that's better or anything. And then we come back to the whole concept of, we historically looked at it from an anthelmintic perspective. We realized that's virtually irrelevant as a topic.
Absolutely.
We've learned a lot about it over our close to 30, my close to 30-year association with it as a plant. We saw reduced DAGs in literature and discussions throughout the time frame we've been dealing with the plantain and ecotane as it stands today. But now we know that there's a diuresis effect with animals, which makes much more sense of why we've got hardened feces and reduced DAGs. And when you look at some of the big production systems today that are transitioning lots and lots of animals, the labour for things like dagging large, finishing sheep policies, when you're taking 7,000 to 25,000 lambs through businesses today, dagging is a huge, big deal. And of course, you've got a range of forages we've just described can moderate the impact of these L3s, but not stop them. DAGs will still be occurring at a high level on chicories, for example, great example. Suddenly the ecotane, the plantain system has another value proposition.
Absolutely.
One that as manpower comes back into light and the ability to come and dag 6,000 lambs because they're all scouring, suddenly there's a value proposition there that you might think about in a new light all over again. So I sort of finish on the plant species that we've worked with over the years with those sort of observations.
It's been a fascinating 50 minutes, and that's raced on really quickly. I guess just in terms of a summary, listen, thanks very much, Trevor, for coming in and sharing your wisdom, but also I think really importantly the history of where we've come from. There's not too many people in the industry that can share views from such a long period and how we've got to where we've got.
And practicing the journey, practicing the whole discussion and adaptation to to changing philosophy.
Yeah, absolutely. And so probably some of the key things I've heard today as a bit of a summary is that we now find ourselves in a situation where from a anthelmintic point of view, we don't have many tools and there's not too many on the horizon, that actually farm systems and actually focusing in on productivity actually looks like it's going to be a really powerful in terms of still having productive systems without the use of anthelmintics. I think the gem that cattle are so useful because they're not sheep, and I really like that. I think the idea that anything other than ryegrass is going to help in terms of controlling those L3 infective larvae and reducing the challenge. I think the use of novel forages, and we've talked about that in terms of not only feeding animals well, but also, again, reducing that challenge. And I think that the big take home for me is if we're focused on all the things that we can do, and we've been through that whole life cycle, all the things that we can do is to reduce challenge and think about where those contaminating lambs are, we're going to be in a much better situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thanks Trevor for your wisdom.
That's right. Enjoyed it.
And I hope you've enjoyed the podcast. I'm actually gonna go and do some fecal egg counts. I'm off, and we'll see you on the next podcast.